Farmers feed the world, and my guest this week can tell us firsthand just how difficult it can be.
Coming from a family farm, I know what it takes to grow a crop and to provide enough support for your animals. And if you don't have access to any of that, it's crushing. These are the things that on a regular basis, keep me up at night.
Beth Bechtel comes from a family which has farmed in Indiana for 7 generations. These days, she's the Deputy Director General at the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, also known as FAO. From the United Nations, I'm Melissa Fleming. This is Awake at Night. Beth, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
It's great to have you here in New York because you're based in Rome.
Exactly. It's nice to be able to get to New York and start really visiting with you and so many of the other colleagues that we don't often, just because of the distance, get to spend that kind of quality time.
You come from a farming family in Indiana in the U.S. Did you ever think growing up that you would go on to fight hunger?
To fight hunger, that's an interesting way to phrase the question. I actually thought as you were getting ready to say this, did you ever think you would have a role in agriculture? And that for certain was a big no. I did just about everything I possibly could growing up to avoid being connected to chores and support. I was probably a pretty terrible teenager. If you were to ask my father, who was leading our family farm at that time, but I had no interest. I wanted to be in a city. I wanted to leave the small town. I didn't connect with agriculture and farming when I was small, and my parents very, I think, supportively. And I look back, and I'm sure there was perhaps some master plan that my sister and I both would find our way back to our roots and to our family's kind of legacy and what's in our DNA as being a part of a farming family. But we pursued all types of other interests, whether it was music or sports or academics. There was none of this tying us to this expectation of the work on the farm per se. And so I left and went to Washington, D.C. for college and was pretty confident that the U.S. Foreign Service was the trajectory. And it was...
Can I just keep you back on the farm,
yeah.
though? I'm just really curious, like, what kind of farm it was. Yeah. What did it look like?
The family farm was incorporated in the mid-1800s. So we're at 7 generations who have all been in rural Indiana on this, sort of same sort of homestead where we operate now. The farm has changed and evolved over time. I mean, obviously, as agriculture has evolved and changed over time, it's a cash grain, corn, soybean, and wheat operation. And interestingly, my sister has found her way, too, back into agriculture. And she is now the president and CEO of the family farm business. And she drives tractors, and she knows how to operate boom sprayers, and she makes seed planting decisions, and she markets the crop, and she takes care of the finances along with her husband. But she really has been the first woman leader in our family to really take this on. And for the work that I do, really trying to support women in agriculture in all of these other countries, I'm just so incredibly proud of her.
Mm-hmm. As little girls and as sisters, I wonder if you could just paint the picture of what your house looked like and what it looked like. did you have to? One always believes if you grow up on a farm, you have to wake up at 5 and do the chores before going to school, and then come home and yeah.
Some of my friends did, probably because they were, again, either required to, or they were a little just generally more helpful or enthusiastic, in fact, to really be a part of their family farm activities. I had probably a 6:30, 7 a.m. wake-up call, had to wait 20, 30 minutes on the yellow school bus that, picked up children that lived miles and miles apart from one another, right? We lived probably about 15 miles from town. And town is, again, about 12,000 people where we grew up. But a lot of beautiful cornfields as far as the eye could see. A pretty traditional white farmhouse with 4 or 5 big red barns, lots of machinery moving in and around. I would say pretty picturesque in the way that people sort of imagine farms today. But behind that, I think one of the things that I realize is how far so many people in the world are today from really understanding what it takes to be in agriculture and what it takes to be a farmer. So there's a lot of risk involved. There's a lot of difficult work days. There are a lot of days that things go completely the wrong direction and machinery breaks down, or, the cows get loose and disease strikes, or bugs come into the crop and it's ruined. And so there's so much of that, I think, what's just very realistic about agriculture and farming. And that's the same if you are in Auburn, Indiana, or you are in Bangladesh.
It's a fundamentally difficult job, and we'll come to that. I mean, you decided to leave Indiana and the farm. You said you weren't terribly enthusiastic about saying you were drawn to the city. So what did you decide to do, and where did you study?
Yeah, so I did go to I did go to Georgetown, again, School of Foreign Service.
Yeah, that's quite a leap for a farm girl
it
from
was.
a small.
It was.
How did you get into Georgetown? I mean, this is one of the most prestigious schools in the country, and also a school that is known for foreign relations.
Yes. So I had one teacher who I think really pushed me into thinking about these issues of the world. He pulled me into the high school speech team and pushed me very specifically into one particular category of event called foreign extemporaneous speaking. So not debate, but basically
foreign extemporaneous speaking?
Extemporaneous.
I didn't have that in my U.S. school. Okay.
So you would go on a Saturday morning with the speech team to another local high school, and there'd be a whole speech competition. And out of an envelope, you'd draw 3 slips of paper, and on each slip would be a particular question about global foreign relations issues of the day. There was a lot happening with the post-Cold War Russia, Gorbachev, glasnost, perestroika, and so there were issues that you just had to sort of start learning about.
And how? Because you couldn't just Google it, right?
No. So we actually, as the speech team, I mean, we practiced every night of the week, and Tuesdays were our research night, and we had hard copy subscriptions to Christian Science Monitor, Financial Times, The Economist, Newsweek, Time. In the course of navigating all of this particular teacher said to me, you staying here and going to school in Indiana, you've got so much more opportunity to keep going with this. And he could tell that I was genuinely interested in these topics. And fortunately, I got into Georgetown, and interestingly at Georgetown, I did have a moment where agriculture found its way back into issues around that I was focusing on international trade. NAFTA was sort of right on the cusp of kind of coming into the global trading landscape. Agriculture, for the first time, was being included in a global trade negotiation. And so after I finished at Georgetown, I actually went back home to Purdue University, where every member of my family has gone. Every member. My grandparents met at Purdue. My parents went to Purdue together because, they met in high school and, they went to so I was the first person in the family not to go to Purdue as an undergraduate, but made my way back there for a master's in agricultural economics. Mm-hmm. And so now have found through my career this blending of international relations, international issues with this fundamental understanding of agricultural sectors and production agriculture.
I believe that by this time you had already also got married or decided?
No, so we got married.
But you met your husband
in high school.
High school,
yeah. So I was a senior and he was a sophomore. So you know what kind of scandal that creates in a small town high school. Now, he asked me out, but our first date, I had already been accepted to Georgetown. And there was a little bit of this will be fun. And 10 years later, we finally got married. So we did a 10-year long-distance relationship while he was still in high school. I was in college, not admitting to many of my friends that I still had a boyfriend in high school.
Who was 2 years younger. At that age, if it were the other way around,
right.
And he was the older one, nobody would care.
No, you're exactly right. But with you, yes. So,
yeah.
And then he went to college. I studied overseas. He studied overseas. And we then ended up coming to Washington, D.C. when I got my first job. He was going into graduate school. And so we lived together for a couple of years, and then when he got through grad school and jobs were settled and we were ready, we finally got married.
And it's also he's also in the agriculture
field.
He
he is now. He wasn't necessarily anticipating that would be the space that he goes into, but he fell in love in his undergraduate experience with this very early days field of remote sensing and geographical information systems, what we now all very understandably know as GIS. He runs a small startup now, big drones, big data, a lot of sensors and imagery work for plant breeders all around the world.
Interesting. Well, you must be very, very much aligned. Your dinner conversations must be very...
We have to
specific
find other,
you have to find other areas.
Find other topics
right?
sometimes.
You went on to work both in the public and in the private sector in the U.S., but your connection to Indiana would always take you back. I believe you went back in 2005.
We did.
Why?
We did. My husband and I, and our daughter was 3 at the time, moved back home because my mom had a terminal health diagnosis just a little bit before that. And we're a small family. It's just my sister and me. And my dad was at the time really, the farmer in the family. And there
How old was she?
She was 54, 53, 54. And it was a situation where it was not you need to be home in 6 months. It was, this will be years, but it will be a continued slow deterioration of her capabilities and capacities. And so we had to recreate lives, even though you sort of think, okay, going home is going to be simple and comfortable. After the experiences we'd both had and what we had started in Washington and the places I think we both felt we were going in each of our different careers, to go back home and to have to try to reset that was was no small task, but I will never, ever regret the decision we made to be with our family and
spend time with your mother.
And spend time with my mom. And our daughter got to grow up in Auburn, Indiana, and found her way to Abu Dhabi for school. And now she's here in New York. And so, you know, from that same 12,000 person small town, she's been able to, I think, use it as a springboard to even more amazing experiences and things that I never could have imagined.
But she didn't choose that agricultural path.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Studying Arabic and Middle Eastern studies.
Yeah.
That's another, but interesting. She had the farm experience. She got to know her grandmother.
She did. And she got to see, she is not a farm girl either. We all sort of laugh about that. But she appreciates it. She too found other passions, and we pushed her into the things that she loved and that she was drawn to. But
was that teacher still there at the school?
No, and she ended up going to a different school in the community. He had since retired. But as she was growing up, these were the kinds of people that I would talk about. You know, Mr. Nagel was just like, you know, this teacher that you have who's pushing you into things that you didn't really understand were going to be special or meaningful for you.
I think if we all look back, there's always one
who
pushed us in a direction. But what pushed you into the direction of the United Nations and FAO?
You know, when we left Washington, I'd had experiences at the Department of Agriculture. I'd been on Capitol Hill and the Senate Agriculture Committee staff. And when I was at USDA, I was actually in an office that had oversight for the relationship with the U.S. government and FAO. And it just turned out that in September of 2019, working from my home office in rural Indiana, my phone rings, and it's a former colleague from the U.S. Department of Agriculture who actually, after he left that position, he came to FAO. But we'd lost touch. There had been no interaction, no reason really for us to stay connected. And he was clearly retired and out of that position, but basically said to me, there's a new director general in the Food and Agriculture Organization. I said, oh, okay. I hadn't seen her. It's not news that I had been following. And he said, well, you know, there's a current DDG who's retiring, an American, and this particular deputy role has historically tended to be filled by an American national. And he said, so the Director General has been given a number of candidates to think about taking on this role, but he's not really seeing the qualities or the attributes in some of these candidates that he's looking for. And I remember so naively, Melissa, saying to this friend, oh boy, you know, I have not been connected to so many people in that global sort of network. You know, I've been back here in Indiana for 15 or more years now. So my community of resources and people that I work with are just not likely good candidates. So I'm sorry that I don't really have any good names for you. And he says, I'm not calling to ask if you have names for me. I'm calling to ask if I could put your name in front of him. And I remember I did. I laughed. And sometimes I am now realizing as I give my daughter, you know, career advice or when she starts moving, like, please, you know, keep a straight face. I mean, sometimes, you know, don't have that immediate inside reaction. Don't always let it come out. But he took it very nicely. He understood why it created a little bit of a reaction to me because it was not something I had even imagined. Again, 20 years earlier, we didn't have such a great sort of relationship or history with this organization. And so entering it at a leadership level just seemed almost comical.
In these 4 years, though, I mean, your job has been tough.
Yeah.
I mean, the state of the world has meant that you've had to deal with just incredible
Yeah.
emergencies linked to wars, linked to horrible, climate situations,
Yeah.
which have led to food crises. And when it comes to hunger and food insecurity, and especially when it comes to wars and conflict, what is keeping you awake at night?
It's two things. One, it is really about how, in my role and representing the entirety of the FAO, how do we bring the world's attention to the people who are most affected by these unbelievable levels of acute food insecurity? And for me, very personally, we finally, I think, are beginning to have people understand that the majority of these people who are in these IPC categories, you know these numbers very well, 3, 4, and 5, right? So this is
IPC, if you could explain.
Yeah, so IPC is a classification structure whereby we collectively as the UN put numbers of people in emergency or crisis-oriented countries into levels of acute food insecurity. And so 3 is crisis, 4 is emergency, and 5 is catastrophe/famine. And so there are currently 282 million people in 60 countries who fall into those 3 categories. So this
3, 4, and 5.
3, 4, and 5 together. When you add those numbers up, 282 million people in 59 countries. The part that we don't, I feel, talk about as much, and I think this is an FAO responsibility, is that at least 2/3 of those 282 million people are farmers. And yet at the same time, only 4% of the entire global humanitarian spend goes to emergency agricultural responses. So our very traditional response, even for us as the entirety of the UN system, has been driven and focused on direct food assistance. It's also water, it's emergency shelter, it's medicines and other public health services. These are all critically important first frontline within hours after, whether it's a climate-related weather event or it is the start of conflict or war or other problems. But we're missing a really important complementary response that also needs to be seen as a frontline response, which is support for agricultural production. And what do I mean by that? It's seeds, it's fertilizer, it's animal vaccines, it's animal nutrition. If you can help people still grow small amounts of vegetables, that they have the ability to keep a few animals in their farm or in their village, we've got a better opportunity, I think, at building resilience into these places while we are still in the midst of an emergency response. And so this prioritizing of the farmer or the face of a farmer as being really some of the most vulnerable people right now in the world is something that I think about day and night all the time.
The most probably extreme of these categories is 5, and it's been declared in Gaza. I remember being on a call recently, our crisis communications call, and your colleague from communications was telling us about deliveries that you were undertaking of animal fodder.
Yeah.
I remember also reading that people were resorting in the north to eating animal fodder. What can you tell us about that? And did the food reach them?
This is the worst situation that we have seen since the data has been collected. To have 1.1 million people in Gaza in IPC 5, this highest level catastrophe famine situation, half of the entire population, we've seen nothing like this in terms of scale. Interestingly, I think a lot of people don't realize. I mean, certainly Gaza and the territories of Palestine are on a scale level nothing like agriculture in Ukraine, for example, right? But it is a place where there has been historically great self-sufficiency in feeding its people and its greenhouse production. So while it's not large amounts of agricultural farmland, olive trees, dairy processing industry, sheep and goats, chickens, a broiler industry that's also got processing that's associated with it. This has been an area that has been really quite self-sufficient. So, we had really raised the issue around animal feed with a number of the authorities involved, especially the Israeli authorities who were navigating access issues at the time. And we came with a number of our other UN partners to say we have trucks of animal feed ready to move. Unfortunately, the approvals never came in a really timely fashion. The challenges continued around, as you well know, the checkpoints and just general access issues where the trucks, for even direct food assistance and support really were not getting in the volumes that they needed to. And so the animal feed just finally, 500 tons, made it in last month. I think my personal, coming from a family farm, I mean, I know what it takes to grow a crop and to provide enough support for your animals. And if you don't have access to any of that, it's crushing. And so these are, again, the things that on a regular basis, keep me up at night.
You mentioned Ukraine, which used to be one of the world's agricultural powerhouses. I think we no one really realized it. You probably knew that, but most of us didn't, that Ukraine was such a breadbasket for so much of the world. What is your biggest concern there?
So we I think have a current rough estimate of about $40 billion worth of damage to the agricultural infrastructure. Not
$40 billion
$40 billion just to agriculture. So that's everything from grain silos and ports to the processing industry to equipment to the land itself. And the land, I think it will be important in a place like Ukraine for all of us to also focus on not just first the demining exercise that is actually underway. In fact, the World Food Program, along with FAO and another NGO, has really been
demining,
has really begun to take a very important leadership role in trying to address that. It's one of the highest priorities actually expressed to us by the Ukraine Ministry of Agriculture. But the other, beyond the mines themselves, is also the soil contamination. So, we also have to think about the health of soil. So when you have all of these bombardments, there is an after effect. I'm not a weapons expert by any stretch, but the heavy metals that come, the contaminants that come from these kinds of explosions and disturbances to the soil means that the soil itself will have very high content of these types of metals and other substances. And so there will also, not just from a removal of mines perspective, there will also have to be a sort of regenerative, bringing back the health of the soil itself. And that's a time-consuming and complicated and very technologically intensive, oftentimes, process.
I mean, again, we've talked about just the devastating impacts of war on food security, and just what it does, the damage it does to the agriculture that people depend on. I mean, we have this horrific war raging in Sudan.
And yet we don't seem to...
it's a forgotten war.
It is.
It was on the...
It is.
Just on the cover of The Economist. That's what it was being called. And yet people are suffering just unbelievably.
Sudan, this war is and the conflict is raging in areas of the country that are its own breadbasket. And so once again, we're going to find ourselves where a country's own ability to produce food, to support its people, will be lost because their planting season is now. And it is June through August. And August is even getting to be a little bit too late for a number of the crops that are grown: sorghum, millet, sesame, okra, groundnut, watermelon. These are all, and it's an incredibly diverse agricultural production that also is not just about staple crops and the most basic of nutrition, but obviously with that diversity of crops that I just mentioned, you know that there's the potential for really nutritious and healthy diets for people locally. But when all of that is gone, then we're back to depending on direct assistance that has to try to get in cross-border. We have access issues in the UN system right now with many of our colleagues trying to figure out the dynamics between the two forces. And so for me, I guess maybe on Sudan personally, back to what is it that Beth Bechtel can do? What can FAO contribute to? This is a place where I'm so disappointed by our donor community, to be very honest. And maybe some of that is on us as FAO, or even on me personally for not being as vocal, not pounding the table as hard enough, not ringing the alarm bell and saying this is desperation. And back to my point about timing. In agriculture, it can't always just be when the whim of a donor or the process, the budgetary, when a congressional supplemental or a fiscal year budget comes. We have to try with our donors and our partners to manage those timelines as best we can, because you get in some places like Sudan one more opportunity, I think, for this particular crop to go into the ground before the cascading effects of a missed or failed crop will really send us into alarming rates of IPC 4 and 5. And so I am trying to say it everywhere I can. It's in Washington, it's in Paris, it's in Berlin, it's in Tokyo, it's with the IFIs, the financial institutions, and I'm empathetic. I mean, there's fatigue on the parts of our traditional donors and partners, and their priorities, their politics, nationally and locally, are shifting in this particular moment. And so, but somehow I think for us, we have to take some of that on as a bit of maybe a new operating reality. And how do we change the story? How do we find different outlets, different channels? How do we get more creative? But in Sudan, when you have a conflict at the scale and the complexity that you have now, it just makes it hard for any of us to really be there and to be able to respond at scale and to be able to respond in as timely of a fashion as we can.
I think you're putting a lot on the UN when actually a lot of the blame is on these people who are starting wars and not stopping them. So if you had one ask, just very in one sentence, for what external actors could do to allow more sustainable support for agriculture and less emergency response, just trying to deliver people one-off, food supplies until they are hungry again for the next.
It's the proverb of teaching a man to fish as opposed to giving a man a fish. Agriculture feeds the world. And so if we have people who can't do that, then we need to recalibrate and we need to think about our structures and our investments and our old habits a bit more.
Well, I have no doubt that you will bring many more farmers that capability all around the world. Beth, it's been a real pleasure to have you here and to hear your story.
Thanks so much, Melissa. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Awake at Night. We'll be back soon with more incredible and inspiring stories from people working against huge challenges to make this world a better and safer place. To find out more about the series and the extraordinary people featured, do visit un.org/awake-at-night. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and please take the time to review us. It helps more people to find the show. Thanks to my editor, Bethany Bell, to Adam Paler, Josie LeBlond, and my colleagues at the UN, Caterina Catidi, Roberta Politi, Geneva Damianti, Tulin Batiki, Becerra Kostova, Angelica Devis, and Carlos Macias. The original music for this podcast was written and performed by Nadine Shaw and produced by Ben Hillier. Additional music was by Pascal Wise.